When I was a lad in school, I remember one of the scariest things was when I realized that there was a test that day that I hadn't studied for. And the same thing can happen to us when we're ready to set up a VPN tunnel, like an IPSEC VPN tunnel from one site to another, and suddenly we realize, wait, I don't exactly know what properties to set, what values I should configure. So in this nugget, we're just going to look together at what those properties are that we want to ensure we're setting up correctly so that when we do get to deployment, we are ready to put those values in without batting an eye. So an IPsec VPN is used when we want to create a site-to-site connection. For example, when we have headquarters that needs to be connected to a branch office and we want the internet to function as if it was a single link, to not have to worry about routing through all those individual connections. Just say, you've got a connection to the internet, I have a connection to the internet. Through the internet, we can securely tunnel and protect our data and connect to each other as if we were only a couple of routers away. Now, key to understanding the way that we configure IPsec is to recognize that this is going to be a reciprocal agreement. We have to have two configured endpoints that are willing to talk to each other and essentially have matched configurations that are willing to work with each other in that setup. So that means we've got a whole set of configuration options we'll have to set up on one side, and we'll need a corresponding matching set of configurations on the other side. One option for an IPsec endpoint is NSX, but the other endpoint could be a variety of other operating systems such as Cisco, Juniper, even Microsoft servers can be IPsec endpoints and allow for tunneling to the network that's behind them. So with what we've got laid out in front of us, we could imagine a couple of edge service gateways from NSX being deployed at the HQ and branch office. And when a client tries to reach a destination system that's on a remote network, the fact that it's on that remote network can trigger the edge service gateway to utilize the IPsec tunnel to encapsulate the message within a larger message that can travel and bounce around the internet until it gets to that branch office where that outer wrapping is discarded, and then the frame can be passed on to the destination. So what are the settings we're going to configure for this? Well, typically we want this to be enabled unless for some reason we manually want to disable the ability to VPN to a specific location. By default, we have perfect forward secrecy, which ensures that new keys, new cryptographic keys, are unrelated to previous keys. It's a way to keep things a little more secure, uses a few more CPU cycles, but it's generally worth it to keep on. What about this responder only checkmark? Well, imagine we had that checked off here in the branch office. That would mean that if HQ needed to pull data from the branch office, they could request that data that would trigger the creation of the IPsec tunnel, and the data could be pulled. But if a client tried to navigate to a server that was on an IP address in the HQ office, that would not trigger the creation of the IPsec tunnel because it's set to respond only. So only use that if you really want to limit the ability of that particular location to be bidirectional. Now, the name for a particular VPN tunnel is generally going to be based upon what we're trying to reach. So in this case, we could imagine on the HQ side, we indicate a VPN tunnel to branch, and on the branch, we indicate a connection to HQ. Then we have the local ID. The local ID is the IP address that's going to be used by the Edge Service Gateway's uplink interface. So essentially, what is the interface that's going to be a tunnel endpoint? It's important to note that the local ID on one end of the tunnel is going to pair up to the peer ID that's set up on the other end of the tunnel. Then we define our endpoints. The local endpoint will also typically be the uplink IP that we're going to use here. If a peer endpoint is any, then that means that we don't care about the specific IP address that's used for the connection. If we want to ensure that we are limiting the input to this VPN from a specific locale, replace any with the actual IP address that will match the peer ID. So essentially, what have we said? We give it a name, and we point to our own local IP address and put it in twice, and we point to the remote IP address, put that in twice, and then we flip that for the other side of the VPN tunnel. Then we need to define the subnets. What are the IP spaces behind that endpoint that we're willing to receive traffic over the VPN for, and that will trigger the use of the VPN when clients from our own subnet go there? The local subnet 172.16.1.0/24, the remote 172.16.100.0/24, and the reciprocal on the other side. And we could comma separate out multiple subnets as necessary to define the policy that triggers the use of the VPN. All that's left is essentially the security logic that's actually going to determine the nuts and bolts of how this particular IPsec tunnel will work. So we can pick whether we want to use Internet Key Exchange in version 1, 2, or IKE Flex. We can choose our authentication algorithm to use with Digest. Will it be SHA-1 or SHA-256? We can choose our encryption algorithm to cipher our data with AES, AES-256, AES-GCM, or Triple DES. Then we have our authentication. Authentication can be based upon a simple pre-shared key, which once we've identified a specific peer endpoint, we can enter here, or if we leave that endpoint with any, it'll use the global configuration. Or instead of a pre-shared key, we could say that this is a certificate-based authentication. The key with certificate-based authentication is that both of the endpoints must have received their certificates from a common certificate authority PKI. In other words, they must both trust the root certificate authority that provided the certificates that they're currently using. So on each endpoint, we would have to request a certificate, download it, request the certificate authority certificate, download and install that, and then we would be able to trust each other when we present those certificates to each other. The bottom line with all of these security configurations is making sure that they match on both sides of your VPN tunnel. Make sure they match and use the best security you can relative to the performance that you need. My friend, by going through this nugget, you've learned where the IPsec VPN fits in your VPN toolkit and some of the settings and values to expect to fill in when you're configuring it here in NSX. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.